I was talking to this technology leader, and they kind of had this idea that platform teams don't need product managers because it's too complicated and technical. And that's where you put all of the complicated, nerdy stuff that customers will never find out about. So that's like your cloud infrastructure, your search engine, your database, all that stuff gets pushed away, and we don't put a product manager on that. And the more I talk to a lot of other engineering leaders in the industry, it seems this is a pretty common understanding that platforms are where we put all the complicated, nerdy stuff. And on the other side, we have this other camp of people who are saying, no, that's absolutely wrong. You should have product managers or somebody with product skill sets inside of those teams. And they shouldn't be working at all that way. They should be working in a completely different model. So today I'm going to explore this from both sides and find out what exactly are we supposed to be doing with our platform teams in the first place. So the core myth is that platforms are actually the thing that we hide all the tech nerdy stuff into that product managers can't touch because they won't understand. It's not customer facing and they shouldn't be part of it in the first place because they'll just mess it up. Real talk, the word platform is deeply misunderstood in our industry, and it's critical that we get past this so we can finally start making things better. And so the anti-pattern that I see the most with platform teams is they say, this is for the tech team to do all the stuff that's too complicated for everyone else to do or too specialized for them to do. And the place this ends up really hurting your organization is you end up building a design of a company where you have a hardwired dependency between two teams. Frequently, you'll end up with something like the cloud, infrastructure, DevOps team, something like this. But the point is that you forever have this moment where things get slow as you try to change stuff across the organization and flip it into value somehow. And that's obviously not fast flow. So how do we solve that? Now, again, a lot of the times I see this, I see one of two things, right? I see that handover, and then I see another approach here, which sometimes it works well, but a lot of the time I've seen it not work so well because people aren't guiding the approach. They don't use like strategic DDD to figure out where's the domain event boundary, or they don't look at the software architecture and discover like, okay, my software architecture, if I don't change this part of it, it means those developers are always going to have to stomp over the same file space. They're always going to need to end up interacting together in a messy way where they always need to figure out what they're doing. How do we remove those boundaries, right? If we're not thinking about this, we're not going to have clean interactions. And so one of the anti-patterns on top of that is somebody will say, well, this team has too much space. What we're going to do is cut it in half. But they don't apply those tools. They're more like Gimli in The Lord of the Rings, trying to smash apart a value stream, but they do it along a boundary that's not clean.
The value stream cannot be destroyed, Gimli, son of Gloin, by any craft that we here possess.
And now you're in a weird situation where you have two teams that are not truly able to work on something independently from end to end on their own. And so they have to coordinate everything back and forth through ceremonies and discussions and things like this. And a lot of the times they end up worse off than if they were going back to one oversized team with more complexity than they should have. But because of all the handover, cross-team communication, alignment problems, politics involved, it's worse. It can be worse if you didn't guide that approach correctly and say, this is where we're making the cut in the value stream. This is where we're making the cut in the product concept. This is where we're making the cut in the domain model, in the software itself. This is how we're restructuring actual lines of code so that developers can own something truly and evolve it, so they can deploy something independently, they can monitor it independently. All those things count towards making those teams independent. And overlooking this stuff is a big problem. But I think this ends up pointing out one of the interesting ways to use a platform team, which is take something away from another team. Don't take away their mission, but take away the things that make their mission complicated. So when we think about the amount of cognitive load that a team is under, that makes it attractive to us to want to apply this axe of Gimli and smash it into two pieces and say, you take half, you take the other half. I find it's useful to talk about something like the space shuttle. Now, if you look into the cockpit of the space shuttle, you'll see something that's just incredibly complicated. I think there's over 2,700 switches in that thing, and you need months and months, if not years, of training to fly it correctly, a lot of simulator practice. The mission is not fly the space shuttle. I think that's a goal for some pilots, but it's not the mission that NASA sets out and says, We're going to launch the Hubble telescope. We're going to repair something. We're going to do science. That's the mission. But the complexity of executing the mission is extremely high because of how complicated it is to fly this machine. And we're limited by how simple that thing is. Now, fast forward half a century and you have a bunch of billionaires cosplaying as Smurfs floating around in space for a joyride. And if you look inside of the Blue Origin spaceship, there's like 0 computer screens in there. Nobody had to push a button to make that thing work because the complexity of getting to space got super low. For me, this is a good metaphor to understand what a platform does, is we didn't take away getting to space. NASA didn't say, okay, you get to the upper ionosphere and at that point, we're going to eject the crew and put in a new crew, and they're going to take the spaceship to the next part of the mission, and we're going to eject that crew and put a new one in and bring that one back to Earth somehow. That's not what they did, right? They had a cohesive mission. They got the job done, but the effort to get to space is so low. You have a room full of people who've probably never thought about how orbital mechanics work and which way they should vector their engines to get back to Earth or get to orbit or get around things. And this for me is the benefit of a platform, is it is a set of improvements that is attractive, that you opt into, that reduces the complexity of your mission. It doesn't take away the mission. You're still going to space. And to be honest, you actually see the exact same thing happening in something like Crew Dragon, where the buttons on the bottom are basically only for emergency. It's like the thing's on fire or the whole computer's broken and I have to deploy the chutes. There's very few buttons on there. And the screens that they have are kind of a more interesting version of what you would see on a commercial flight when you look at your trajectory around the Earth. Those astronauts are not doing anything on that spacecraft. It's completely flown without them. And they get to do their mission, right? They get to do the resupply of the space station. And so taking that back to technology, that's the thing we need to look for, is what's the stuff we can do to remove the complexity, to remove the cognitive load. You wouldn't take the space shuttle and cut it in half with a buzzsaw to make it easier to fly, right? You have to figure out how to simplify the things people are working with to make their mission easier. And that doesn't always need to be a team full of people. One of the best approaches you can take to a platform is the thinnest viable platform approach, which could be as something as simple as a document. And that document just explains the standards to do something by. Now, as that thing becomes a magnet, and it's a natural magnet for complexity of stuff that's deep in the value chain. And if you ever look at something like the user needs mapping activity in team topologies, you'll see that at the top, you have a user, they need something. Usually those are stream aligned teams up at the top. And as you get down to the bottom, it tends to be the platformy topics. It doesn't mean it's always like that, but it's a pretty good trend. Those things deep in the supply chain end up being magnets for those complicated stuff that we really don't see customers interacting with so often. Those things deep in the supply chain of how does a user get some value end up being really obscured from the customer. And so it feels natural to put a team around that complexity and say, okay, you're going to handle it. Now, the dysfunction happens when that team is interacting in a way where one of two things happen. Either they're a task butler and their whole job is to do part of the mission for other teams. So another team is 90% done and they come over and say, hey, I'm almost done. You finish it. This is the last piece. Get it done. This ends up bottlenecking the delivery of value, especially when usually that's something that you only have one team around. And when your technical leadership is afraid of having an internal marketplace of ideas. I think at some small scale of a company, an internal marketplace of ideas should not be on the big things because you won't be able to break even. But as you get bigger and bigger, you need that internal marketplace of ideas. And if you think of a bigger company like Amazon, they are in an aggressive internal marketplace of ideas. The other anti-pattern here is everybody depends on a platform, but that platform is constantly shoving solutions onto other teams and not allowing those teams any choice about what they do with it. And this leads to, slowing down the whole organization to the pace of not just what that one team can do, but quite often how well they can orchestrate a super mega transition project across all the consuming teams. So getting the mode of interaction for your platform team correct is extremely important if you want to be using this concept correctly and moving fast. And one of the ways that I found quite interesting to think about this is if you have a customer going into a restaurant to order something, they don't get involved in each other's business. The customer is not forced to use this restaurant. They could go somewhere else if they wanted, and they simply need to state their request. And what's interesting is the customer is just looking for food. It could come from anywhere, but the restaurant staff is not going to come over, pre-chew the food, then give it to the customer. It's up to the customer what to do with that food. If they want to take it home, if they want to eat it in the restaurant, if they want to share it with their friend, if they want to eat the French fries first or the hamburger second or the hamburger first and the fries second. It's not the business of the restaurant. At the same time, you don't have these bizarre interactions like the customer has to go into the back kitchen of the restaurant to put the pickles on the hamburger because they're the only one who really knows how to put pickles on a hamburger, and this is beyond anybody's understanding except their own. But for some reason in tech, we end up doing this all the time. For instance, you could have a team that has some message queue and you say, okay, well, this is the only team who's allowed to approve the queue structure because we've designed the architecture in such a way that everything is high risk. There's no resilience. There's no risk tolerance. Everything will break unless we have one person looking after the whole system. So getting your software architecture wrong cascades into now your team is a bunch of task butlers who have to chew everyone's food for them. So it's really important to get this stuff right from the beginning. Or you could have another situation where, you want to deploy a brand new service, but you can't do that because you have to go talk to the platform team. But the platform team is busy, so they don't have time to create your new system. But you have no other way of getting this work done because you don't own it and you're not allowed to touch it. And the amount of fear in getting somebody who doesn't know that system to ever touch it is enormous when there's a lot of really good known ways to acquire knowledge. One of them being the method of facilitating knowledge in people or making it simpler to fly that spaceship. And I think for me, that's really one of the important things here is the restaurant is not forcing you to eat their food. If you wanted to, you could go and scratch your own itch without having a dedicated itch scratcher on standby for you who's really busy scratching everyone else's itches because everybody's not allowed to scratch their own itch. And so to bring all of this back to product management, I think this is why we need product management skills. Maybe you don't need a product manager per se, but you need somebody who is skilled in the stuff product managers are usually skilled in, thinking about these topics. And that's stuff like figuring out who is going to consume my service. What's the market like for this stuff? What do they need? Is it working for them? How do I test that? How do I find out? How do I do my basic discovery? Because more often than not, these anti-platforms are often plagued with a lack of discovery, a lack of education, a lack of consultation with people who might want to use your service. And you end up having slow adoption of those systems, inability for people to move fastly independently. Those platforms end up bottlenecking throughout your whole system. And because things in the platforms usually aren't built as an optional thing, the other anti-pattern that we see play out very often is all of the teams that use these anti-platforms end up not being able to update something important that this anti-platform needs change, and that escalates and escalates, and eventually product engineering leadership says, okay, everybody, we're going to take a month and we're all going to change something, but they all have to make one giant coordinated change at once. So your platform technology is one of the most irritating things in your organization because of how it's forcing bad project management and surprise changes and hijacking of roadmaps because things weren't designed opt-in, because there was a permissive allowance to create a task butler culture, because we didn't have product management thinking inside of those teams helping us think through how do we make this stuff work in an opt-in environment where we can extract not the mission, the cognitive load from those other teams. And to get all of that done, in my opinion, you want the skills that great product managers have inside of that team thinking about these things. And I understand that's a challenge because a lot of product managers have a bit of challenge switching gears from I don't have an external customer, I have an internal consumer team who's working with me on this thing. To be honest, I don't think it's a massive leap, but I have noticed that there is a very frequent hesitancy for product managers to do this work because they're afraid they're no longer going to talk to customers. And from engineering product leaders saying, well, product managers are for customers. We don't need it for a search engine. This sounds wasteful. I don't understand the purpose of it. And the purpose is make sure that team does not become a bottleneck in how your organization works. And for engineering leaders, I really want you to understand this, because if you allow the entire company to understand platforms are a techie thing, it's going to end up looking like a line in a balance sheet somewhere that says platform cost, and all the platform teams will be rolled up in a cost and they'll say platform cost. And the value of this thing, if it's not articulated correctly as helping other teams move fastly, in fact, it's surrounded by constant complaints of how slow things are, what's likely to happen is your executive team or your board team is going to look at that and say, we have to fix something in there. And one of the solutions to that is, well, we should cut the budget to that thing because we're not getting the results we need. Or it should be, let's rotate the staff to get better people in there, or a million other things that you don't want happening. So it's really important that you can express to everyone not only what the value of your product is, but also making sure it's not a bottleneck to the delivery of value and change through your company. Again, these things are core fundamentals for product thinking. And I think even a lot of designer skills could fit in there. I don't mean making the user interface nice. I just mean designers have a way of looking at things like this. Even though there's no user interface in there, the ways they think about problems can also be quite interesting in here. Now, I'm not advocating for putting designers in your platform organizations. I'm just saying open your mind about the kinds of cross-functional skills that will be beneficial inside of a platform. Is this myth busted? I think so, because what we've discovered in this video is that product management thinking inside of a platform team is critical when you want to encourage modes of operations, especially things like how they interact with the other teams, in a way that encourages fast flow. Your consumer teams are a type of customer. You have to find out what you need. You have to make your offering attractive to them. You can't simply force feed them something you've come up with, and you can't offer them a white glove service where you just do everything for them, because you will end up bottlenecking the organization. And to be honest, I've seen too many cases where platform engineers burn out because they have such a workload and so many people competing to give them tasks. And again, I think it's really important to remember the platform team is this sort of accelerator for innovation. So when it's being used correctly, you're extracting not the mission, you're extracting the cognitive load from those teams. You're not flying the space shuttle for them, you're making it easier for them to get to space. And it's an important difference, because if you're missing this, you're either force feeding teams something they're not ready for, or a task butler, which slows down everything going through the organization. So that core modus operandi of extracting the cognitive load through your offering without taking away parts of their work for them, that is the most challenging part, and exactly the kind of thing that I want people who think like product managers doing. Now, I'm not going to make the claim you always need to hire a product manager per platform team, but the type of skills inside of the team, when you look at all the people, it needs to come to a certain threshold where that work is getting done. And traditionally, we do that by hiring a product manager. I am sure you could do that in other ways, but that work needs to be accounted for, and you need to make sure your organization works for that too. Because if your organization doesn't expect anyone in the team to have those skills, you might not actually have them inside of your team when you go and look what's going on inside of your team. So for me, this is one of the most interesting things to think about, and the reason that I would say that this myth is busted. The platform is not a place to scurry away the developers that don't talk to customers. It's a place to make everyone faster. And if it's working correctly, it's because they consider themselves to be offering a service to the rest of the company through a low bandwidth interaction like the X as a service interaction mode, as a default way for them to be interacting with everyone. That way they don't become a bottleneck, nobody's handcuffed to them. And after a few iterations, your other teams get to move faster at the things that they truly care about, without all the complexity of the things that are not relevant to specifically that mission. And with that, I hope you enjoyed everything we talked about today. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see future myths and other videos from me. And I hope you have a great day. Take care.